Hey everyone. So, there's a lot of noise right now about trade, about tariffs, about deficits, about whether countries like China are cheating the system, or whether the US is just bad at competing. But honestly, I think the way people talk about trade, especially online and in politics, misses the point. So, in this video, I want to talk you through the bigger picture. We're going to talk about what actually causes trade imbalances, how global savings and income distribution quietly shape everything, why the US keeps ending up with massive trade deficits, and whether tariffs are actually helping or just making things worse. And yes, we'll start with a good old Econ 101 story about comparative advantage, but we're going to take it a lot further than that. This video is heavily inspired by the work of economist Michael Pettis, who's written extensively about how trade, capital flows, and income distribution are all connected. I've linked some of his articles down below in the description if you want to dig deeper. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, picture this. We've got two neighbors, Greg and Jenny. Every morning, Greg wakes up, waves awkwardly at Jenny, and heads out to his garlic farm. Greg, bless his heart, can farm up to 10 garlic a day. Jenny, meanwhile, can manage just 8. However, when evening rolls around, they both switch to making tools for their farm. Greg could crank out up to 3 tools a day, while Jenny can manage a solid 5. Now, one morning, Jenny has an idea. She realizes, hey, Greg's really good at garlic, and she's definitely got the upper hand in tool making. So, she marches over and she proposes a deal. Hey, Greg, what if you focused on garlic and I handled the tools? We could trade with each other, and honestly, we'd both come out ahead. Now, Greg isn't exactly Einstein, but he does have a crush on Jenny. So, eager to impress, he quickly agrees. Sorry, Greg. Hate to break it to you, but Jenny only wants you for your garlic. Let's see if Jenny's onto something. Initially, when they split their day between garlic and tool making, Greg produces 5 garlic a day and an average of 1.5 tools daily. Jenny, meanwhile, produces 4 garlic a day and an average of 2.5 tools daily. Let's see what happens after specialization. But after specializing, Greg, focusing completely on garlic, produces 10 garlic a day. Jenny, dedicating her whole day to tool making, produces 5 tools. Now, if they trade and split their combined production evenly, Greg still gets his usual 5 garlic, but now he gets an average of 2.5 tools daily, a full extra item compared to before. Jenny keeps her usual 2.5 tools, but now receives 5 garlic, one more than she had before. See that? By specializing in trading, both Greg and Jenny clearly benefit. Greg gets some extra tools, and Jenny gets the extra garlic she wants. A win-win. But wait, it gets even better. When people specialize, something amazing happens. They become better at what they do. If I practice pickleball all day, my skills will get better. I mean, they can't get any worse, so maybe that's not the best example. But Greg, when focusing on garlic, becomes a garlic growing wizard, pumping out garlic at record speed. Jenny, meanwhile, masters tool making, smithing faster than ever. In short, specialization doesn't just make them better off initially, it helps them become even more efficient over time. Productivity rises, and everybody gets more garlic and more tools. Maybe even Greg can finally get good enough to impress Jenny, but maybe that's some wishful thinking. Hold up, you say. What if one person is better at everything? Why, thank you, hypothetical person I made up to illustrate a point. You might wonder, what if Jenny's both better at garlic and tool making? Does specialization still make sense? Absolutely. Let's say Jenny is a wonder kid. She produces 12 garlic and 8 tools a day. Greg still manages only 10 garlic and up to 3 tools a day. Let's see if specialization still helps. Even then, we see that specialization helps. Why? Because what matters is relative efficiency, what economists call comparative advantage. Greg is relatively better at garlic compared to his tool-making skills, and Jenny, though she's better at both, is relatively better at tool-making. So, if Greg specializes fully in garlic and Jenny fully in toolmaking, they're still both better off after trading. In this case, if we value a tool as being worth 2 garlic, and Jenny trades 3 tools for 6 garlic, then we see she ends up with 6 garlic and 5 tools, while Greg ends up with 4 garlic and 3 tools. So they are both better off, but Jenny, as the more productive worker, will end up with more. In other words, even when one party is better at everything, trade and specialization still create a win-win scenario. So, Greg can breathe easy. Jenny might be superhuman, but she still needs his garlic. Though, maybe not any more than that. So what's our takeaway? Well, the same concept that works for Greg and Jenny applies to countries as well. If countries specialize by focusing on their comparative advantages and then trade with each other, everyone ends up better off. So there you have it. End of story, right? Trade barriers must be bad because they interfere with comparative advantage. Or at least that's what you'd hear in an Econ 101 class. But as it turns out, the real world is a little bit more complicated. If I haven't lost you yet, let's dive deeper into the more nuanced aspects of global trade and why this simple story doesn't always match reality.
Okay, quick trigger warning. I'm about to introduce a tiny bit of math. Now, before you panic and run away screaming, I promise it's just basic algebra, nothing too scary. We'll get through this together. I promise. To really understand what's going on, we need to meet another one of our Econ 101 friends, GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, which is basically a fancy economist way of saying how much stuff does our country make. Now, GDP can be broken down into 4 main parts. Here's how we write it down. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, where C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, and NX is net exports. Let's talk about what each of these mean. Consumption is how much regular people like you and me spend on goods and services. Groceries, cars, Netflix subscriptions, basically everything we buy to live our daily lives. Investment here doesn't mean buying stocks. It means spending money on things like buildings, equipment, and infrastructure, things that help us produce more things in the future. Government spending is how much the government spends on goods and services. Schools, roads, military, salaries of public employees, whatever. And net exports is just everything we ship minus everything that we bring in. Now you might be thinking, wait, what about government infrastructure spending? Isn't that investment? So, a bit of a side note here. Yes, that's a fair argument. Technically, when governments build roads, bridges, or schools, they're clearly making investments in the future. But in GDP accounting, that kind of spending is usually included under government spending, not investment. I didn't come up with it, that's just how the accounting works. Why? It's mostly a historical convention. It helps economists separate public from private sector activity, even if functionally it behaves like investment. So, just keep in mind that even though government investment acts like investment, it gets counted under G. Great. Now we have an understanding of GDP, we can move on to talk about savings and consumption, and why it matters if a country has a high savings rate. I promise this will all tie into tariffs at some point, but we'll need to do a little more econ review before we can get there.
Now that we understand the structure of GDP, we're ready to look more closely at how savings and consumption fit into the picture, and why they matter when we're trying to understand trade imbalances and tariffs. Let's start with a simple but powerful economic identity. In any economy, savings must equal investment plus net exports. This isn't a theory or a model, it's an accounting identity, meaning it must always be true. If a country saves more than it invests domestically, the difference is reflected in net exports. In other words, the excess savings are effectively sent abroad.
It's common to hear some countries are simply more frugal, that their populations are more naturally inclined to save more. This explanation often shows up in discussions of countries that have persistent trade surpluses, like Germany, Japan, or the Netherlands. But while cultural attitudes towards money may play a role in personal finance, they don't explain national level savings behavior. So where do these high saving rates actually come from? Well, remember our identity. Savings are equal to investments plus net exports. That means if a country is saving more, something else in the economy has to be changing to make that happen. One way to look at this is that any policy that encourages more investment or shifts income away from consumption will naturally lead to a higher savings rate. It's not about how thrifty people are, it's about how income is distributed across parts of GDP. This suggests that a larger share of income is not being spent by households, but is instead being retained by firms or businesses, reinvested or saved by higher income groups. This isn't natural or cultural, it's structural. It's about how income is distributed. Here's the key idea. Firms don't spend income on everyday goods and services. They are not final end consumers. They typically reinvest earnings into future production or return them to owners and shareholders. And those people tend to be in higher income brackets and therefore save a larger proportion of their income. So, when income shifts towards businesses or high income households, consumption tends to decrease while investment increases. And since savings are equal to investment plus net exports, if investment goes up but consumption goes down, total savings rise. They have to by definition. So here's a question. What actually increases savings? Well, there's a wide range of domestic policies that can shift income toward investment, and I won't go over them in detail, but I'll list some of them here and put them on screen, along with a brief explanation of each. We have tariffs and import quotas, currency depreciation, interest rates, weak social safety nets, environmental degradation, weak labor rights. These mechanisms can exist even in rich countries with high productivity. The key isn't low wages, it's low wages relative to productivity. And when that happens, you end up with high national savings, low domestic consumption, and almost inevitably a trade surplus. That leads us to our next point, which is the demand gap. All right, so we've just learned that if a country saves more than it consumes, those savings have to show up somewhere in the form of either investments or net exports. But that also reveals a deeper issue. What we're actually dealing with is a demand gap. The economy is producing more than its citizens can afford to buy, because too little income is going to people who do the consuming. So now the question becomes, what do you do with stuff you can't sell domestically? Let's walk through three possible answers. Two real, one hypothetical, but all very revealing. Option 1, domestic investment. The first option is to take those excess savings and invest them at home. Build more factories, pave more roads, expand production even further. This might sound all well and good, but wait. If your economy already produces more than people can afford to buy, is adding more production capacity really a great idea? Not usually. That's how you get things like ghost cities, empty office parks, and unneeded infrastructure. In fact, this is exactly what we saw in China during the global financial crisis. Net exports collapsed as the world stopped buying. But instead of shifting towards consumption, China dramatically ramped up domestic investment. And with that surge came an explosion in debt. Public and private debt as a share of GDP ballooned. Now here's the kicker. If an investment is truly productive, if it creates more value than it costs, it should lower your debt to GDP ratio over time, even if you borrow to pay for it. That didn't happen, which is a pretty strong hint that much of that investment was, well, not worth it. Option 2, exporting the excess, what typically happens. The second option, what happens in most surplus countries, is to export that excess production abroad. This isn't about comparative advantage or smart trade policy. This is about pushing your domestic demand shortfall onto other countries. You relatively underpay your workers, they can't buy what they produce, and you send goods abroad. The other country absorbs the demand, and as we'll see later, there are pretty bad consequences with this. But let's check in on our third option. The hypothetical closed system. Now, here's a third option, one that doesn't happen in the real world, but teaches us something incredibly important. Imagine your country is completely cut off from the rest of the world. No trade, no capital flows, just a closed loop. In that case, your excess goods can't be exported. They pile up as inventory, which in GDP accounting is temporarily counted as investment. But this can't last. Eventually, businesses realize no one's buying, they scale back production, and layoffs start. By definition, an unemployed person must consume more than they produce, as they produce nothing. So, if they consume anything, they're a net consumer. So, as unemployment rises, the savings rate declines. In this case, GDP contracts, and so probably does consumption. But critically, consumption will decline slower than GDP, driving down our savings rate until it's balanced. Notice that the system self-corrects, not through growth, but through recession. It's painful, but it restores balance. Lower savings, lower production, higher consumption. But wait a minute, isn't the world just a closed system? Yes! There's nowhere for total excess savings to go. If one country oversaves and underconsumes, some other country must undersave and overconsume. And just like our closed loop example, the adjustment eventually shows up in the form of layoffs, debt, and declining industries, just not in the country that caused the imbalance. So the question now isn't just what countries do with their excess saving, it's who ends up holding the bag. And as we'll see next, it's often the countries with the most open, attractive capital markets, because capital doesn't always flow where the need is, it often flows where the door is most open. Okay, so we've done some work, and along the way, we've uncovered this kind of counterintuitive idea. Countries with high savings rates often have high net exports. That is, they're exporting more than they import, not because they're better at trade or smarter at money, but because they aren't consuming enough of what they make. They're saving too much, and that excess has to go somewhere. But wait, people don't usually give things away for free, right? So how do countries get compensated for all of these net exports? Well, the country running a surplus isn't just handing over goods. They're getting something in return. Claims on foreign assets. That's right. When you run a trade surplus, you're basically lending your excess savings to someone else. And in return, you get IOUs. That could be stocks, bonds, real estates, beanie babies, whatever the market's offering. So let's make this a little more concrete with a scenario. Country A is running a trade surplus. Why? Because of the policies we just talked about. Low wages, high savings, suppressed consumption. Country B is importing more from A than it exports back. So it's running a deficit with A. But here's the twist. Country A isn't using those export earnings to invest in Country B, the ones they actually trade with. Instead, they go shopping in Country C. Why? Because Country C has open financial markets. It's easy to buy stocks, bonds, real estate, whatever. Now here's the key point. It doesn't matter where the original trade happened. What matters is where the money ends up. If the savings from Country A end up flowing into Country C, then Country C has to adjust, typically by running a trade deficit. That's just how the balance of payments works. Now, I'll admit, I'm simplifying a bit here. There's more going on under the hood. So for those of you who want the technical breakdown, I'll flash it on screen for a moment, so you can pause and take a closer look. The key thing here is that when money comes in from abroad to buy local assets, an equal amount has to leave, typically in the form of a trade deficit. So even though Country C has nothing to do with the original imbalance, they're now stuck absorbing the world's excess savings. If you're the country with the most attractive financial market, congrats. You just volunteered to carry someone else's demand gap. If one country oversaves and underspends, another country must overspend and undersave, whether it wants to or not. This is how global balances get redistributed. Trade surpluses aren't isolated. They ripple outward through the financial system, pulling other countries in their wake. So now you might be starting to see the full picture. When country A suppresses wages and runs a big surplus, the country that ends up holding the bag might not be B, it might be C, just because it had the misfortune of having good markets. This sets the stage for our next question. What actually happens inside C when those foreign funds hit? Do they invest? Do they build factories? Or do they just rack up debt and hollow out their industries? Spoiler alert, it's usually not new factories. So, we've talked about excess savings and how countries with open, well-regulated financial markets, cough, cough, the United States,
tend to be the consumer of last resort. Why? Because foreign funds need somewhere to go, and the US has the most accessible and desirable asset markets in the world. Let's head back to our favorite formula. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. That's consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Now remember, if foreign funds are flowing into your country because someone with high savings wants your assets, you're running a trade deficit. Your NX is going down. So the question is, how does the rest of the GDP formula respond? What has to go up to keep the whole equation from collapsing?
Option 1. Create new assets. The ideal. In theory, this would be great. We'd respond to foreign funds by investing in new stuff. Factories, infrastructure, R&D. That means investment goes up to match the decline in net exports, maybe even exceed it. Everybody wins. Spoiler alert, this almost never happens. Why not? Because in developed countries like the US, we already have roads, bridges, and electric grids. There's no shortage of funds. There's a shortage of profitable new things to invest in. Sell off existing assets. Since we're not creating new investment opportunities, the second thing that happens is we just sell off existing assets to foreign investors. Stocks, bonds, real estate, a collection of rare air fryers. Not that I would, but like hypothetically. Anyways, here's the key. Nothing new is built. In GDP terms, net exports go down, investment stays flat, consumption doesn't change, and neither does government spending. So GDP drops. You've replaced domestic demand with foreign demand, and it shows. Firms cut back, some go out of business, layoffs begin. Now, let's pause and tackle a very common misunderstanding. People say, oh, we can't compete because wages are too high here. But that's not quite right. What matters isn't the absolute wage. It's how much a worker is paid relative to their productivity. If a worker from a different country is 3 times less productive, but also earns 1/3 the wage, the net cost is the same. That's not a competitive problem. The real problem is when wages are artificially suppressed relative to productivity. That's what creates trade distortions and unfair competition. Remember that whole comparative advantage thing with Greg and Jenny? This is exactly the same. Even when someone is better at everything, what matters is relative efficiency across tasks. So, let's look at our third option. What happens when investment doesn't go up and consumption doesn't cover the drop in net exports? Enter the government. Increase spending, cut taxes, stimulus checks, infrastructure bills, whatever it takes to keep demand afloat. And how do they pay for it? They borrow. A lot. This is what we've seen in the US and other deficit countries. Government spending fills the void left by the trade deficit. In other words, the government props up demand to compensate for the demand gap caused by someone else's excess savings. The catch? This system is unsustainable. Here's the problem with the whole setup. It's fundamentally unhealthy. It's not how trade is supposed to work. One country suppresses its consumption and builds a surplus. Another absorbs that surplus through deficits, and instead of balancing through investment, it just racks up debt. It might keep unemployment down in the short term, but it's a band-aid. The underlying wound, imbalanced savings and distorted income distribution, is still festering. So, now that we know what happens inside countries that absorb foreign capital, the final piece of the puzzle is to ask, what can we actually do about this? Okay, we've just gone on a journey. We've talked about excess savings, trade imbalances, capital flows, and the US acting as the world's consumer of last resort. So now you might be wondering, can't we just slap some tariffs on stuff and make it go away? Here's the 1700s Econ 101 version. Tariffs raise the prices of imported goods, which encourages people to buy more domestic products. That boosts domestic production and employment. Sounds great, right? But remember from earlier, the trade imbalance isn't just about who's buying what, it's about who's saving too much and who's forced to absorb those savings. Tariffs work by making imports more expensive for your own people and those same imports cheaper abroad. But here's where it gets interesting. The real effect isn't just about prices. It's about who gets income and how much of it they spend. Think about it. Tariffs are a tax on consumption. You, the consumer, are now paying more for the same imported good.
That means you got less real income to spend elsewhere. Lower household share of national income equals lower consumption equals higher savings. Meanwhile, on the foreign side, exporters facing tariffs often have to cut prices to stay competitive. That might hurt producers, but it's great for foreign consumers, who now pay less. Higher household share equals higher consumption equals lower savings. So the net result of tariffs? They can help reduce savings imbalances by shifting income shares. In foreign markets, less to businesses, more to households, more consumption, less savings. In local markets, where consumption is too high relative to savings, it's a tax on consumers and a subsidy to businesses. Sounds great in theory, right? Well, maybe not if you're a consumer, but at least from an economic theory point of view. But, and this is a big but, it does this in a really roundabout and inefficient way. Here's the punchline. If the real issue is too much global savings, the direct solution is to manage where those savings flow, through currency policy or capital controls, not to tax trade. Tariffs try to reduce savings by shifting income from households via higher prices, but that's a messy, distortionary, and often politically explosive way to do it. Let's get to the core of the problem with using tariffs to try to fix trade imbalances. As long as countries with excess savings can make claims on foreign assets, and as long as global trade can redirect through third-party countries, your trade deficit can remain, even if you're not trading much with the surplus country itself. In other words, the imbalance doesn't need to flow through the same trade lane. If funds from a surplus country are flowing into your asset markets, then you must run a deficit. That's accounting. It doesn't matter who you're trading with, you're still running a deficit. This is why bilateral trade deficits, or trade deficits between two individual countries, are basically meaningless. Just because you run a deficit with country X doesn't mean country X caused the global imbalance. But when tariffs are set on bilateral deficits, we end up playing whack-a-mole, slapping tariffs on every country we run a deficit with, regardless of whether they're contributing to the global savings glut.
And what happens when you do that? You start to break down comparative advantage, which, if you remember Greg and Jenny, is one of the few things in Econ 101 that actually works. You reduce efficiency, raise prices, and shrink the total value of what the global economy can produce and consume. So sure, tariffs can nudge trade balances on paper, but they do it in a very inefficient way, and they don't address the underlying imbalance. So, if tariffs don't really solve the problem, and sometimes make it worse, what would an actual solution look like? Well, I'll save that for another video, since I feel like this one is already getting a bit too long. For now, let's do a review.
Alright, let's bring this all home. We started with a classic Econ 101 idea, comparative advantage. And sure, when income is typically distributed and trade is balanced, that story mostly holds. But once you start suppressing consumption, when workers get underpaid relative to their production, that model breaks. High savings rates lead to trade surpluses, and countries like the US, with open financial markets, become the shock absorbers of global imbalances. This causes rising debt, hollowed out industries, and a government constantly stuck in the role of economic firefighter, plugging the demand gap with deficit spending. Tariffs? They treat the symptoms poorly. They don't solve the underlying cause, income distribution and excess savings in some economies. If we want a healthier system, we have to stop thinking of trade as the starting point. Trade imbalances are just the reflection of deeper structural forces, how income is distributed, how much is saved, and where money flows. Thank you for sticking with me. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who you think could benefit from this explanation. Anyways, see you next time.